Okay, so I've been thinking this over for the last few days. If I was on a stage and had to just dance to music for between 30 and 40 minutes, I think the number one song I would choose would be Call on Me. I feel like you could just ride that beat for a good 30 minutes and everyone would enjoy it and I would enjoy myself. I don't know. Do you guys have your song of choice for your awkward mini dance on a stage?
Oh, that's a great question. Maybe I Want to Dance with Somebody by Whitney Houston. That would probably be it. But
everyone would love
it's
that.
It's a good one. It's a good one. It's a banger.
I feel like standing on stage and having people look at me while music plays for 39 minutes is maybe one of my greatest fears in this entire world.
Welcome to the Campaign Moment on this Friday, October 18th. I'm Martine Powers, co-host of Post Reports.
And I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. We're also joined this week by national political reporter Marianne Levine. Hey, Marianne.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. All right, so before we kick things off, I want to talk through a couple headlines from this week that folks might have come across. First of all, yesterday, Israel announced that its forces killed Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar.
Yeah, so Harris commented as a function of her current job as vice president, not necessarily as a candidate for president. And she said,
"To any terrorist who kills Americans, threatens the American people, or threatens our troops or our interests, know this, we will always bring you to justice."
Trump, meanwhile, offered some general comments when asked by reporters on Friday afternoon.
My reaction is he was not a good person. That's my reaction. That's sometimes what happens.
And then what other big campaign stories have you been following this week?
Yeah, so this week we're going to dive deep into the world of Donald Trump's recent rallies, which Marianne has been watching closely. They've started getting a little bit more bizarre.
And then we're also going to be talking about the Harris campaign and her big interview with Fox News. And we'll get to that later in the conversation. But Marianne, I want to start with you because you've been following Trump around this week. And as we just said, some of the things that we're seeing on the campaign trail have been getting a little bit more bizarre. It's been very interesting to read your dispatches. What has it been like on the campaign trail with Trump in this last stretch of the race?
Well, Trump is really ramping up a lot of his activity. I think that earlier this year, even as going back as far as the summer, he was not doing events with this level of intense frequency. And so I think that we're in this final stretch where he's having multiple events a day. I noticed that in Atlanta, I was at his rally there on Tuesday. His speech was definitely shorter than the typical 90 minutes or so. So it feels like he's just trying to cram a lot more in just in this final stretch.
And is that a reflection of just how close the race is or that he and his campaign are nervous?
I think it's a reflection of how close the race is. I don't think his campaign would ever openly say that they're nervous, but I think that it is a reflection of how close this is. And I think we can really tell, where he's focusing his attention. He'll be in Pennsylvania again this weekend twice after being there on Monday, which I think really highlights how critical that state is for him. He's going to North Carolina on Monday. He's also was in Georgia this week. And so I think those three states are really important for him, as we've previously discussed on this podcast. And I think that that's really reflected in his campaign schedule and really reflected in just how close this is in the final weeks of this election.
So, Marianne, can you talk about some of the moments from this week that have really stuck out to you? We alluded at the top of the show to the rally in Oaks, Pennsylvania, where he was standing on stage, dancing for 39 minutes, listening to music after a couple medical emergencies in the crowd. What are the moments that really struck you?
I think that's probably the moment that sticks out to me the most, and probably to most of our readers this entire week.
Though I have to say, I didn't really understand what happened. In reading the headlines about it and reading some of the coverage, it's okay, so there was a medical emergency, so then they stopped, which kind of makes sense, but then did they just not start back up again, or was he just hanging out on stage after he'd answer some questions just to make people happy. Like, I just couldn't tell. Can you describe, like, what actually transpired?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it was certainly unusual. So basically what happened was, and this happens frequently at Trump rallies where someone faints and he pauses his speech and he often tells the doctor, take your time. It was a little surprising because this was an indoor event, and I think there were certain parts of the venue where people were feeling like overheated. And so what happens is the first person appears to faint. And Trump pauses.
Okay. Hold it,
we
please.
have somebody.
A doctor, please. Doctor. Thank you very much.
And you see the other attendees fanning the man who fainted. And the attendees start singing God Bless America. And Trump basically starts talking about Ave Maria and how maybe he should play Ave Maria while they're waiting.
If they could work really quickly backstage while we're waiting, Ave Maria. We had Ave Maria the other day.
Ave Maria without the lyrics comes on, and then the man gets taken away on a stretcher, and Trump resumes the event. But then moments later, a second person appears to also need medical attention, and Trump pauses his remarks. He tells the doctor to take their time. The first responders come on and help the second individual.
Thank you very much. Take your time, doctor.
And then Trump basically starts to resume his conversation with Kristi Noem. South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem is the moderator. And then he basically decides he's done taking questions for the night.
Let's not do any more questions. Let's just listen to music. Let's make it into a music. Who the hell wants to hear questions, right?
And starts to play music again.
So play YMCA. Go ahead. Let's go. Nice and loud.
Here we go, everybody.
And then he goes through really his rally classics. And it was funny because our colleague Jabin Vosper got a photo of the teleprompter that said, please take 2 more questions before music. And so
I did not take that advice.
Yeah. And so he basically decides, I'm done taking questions. And I know it kind of reminded me of like sometimes when you're really like tired and you just want to listen to music, which is sometimes how I feel on the campaign trail. But he basically plays all these songs. And I think what was striking was so many people started to leave, but also a lot of people just stayed to watch him dance and to watch him just like sway on stage. And so it was
bop, as we say.
Bop, yeah. So and that went on for 39 minutes. So it was
Which is a long time.
Which is quite a while. And I think it was a little bit confusing to some of the crowd because they weren't sure if Trump was going to talk again or if this was just the end of the event. That was definitely the scene I think that stuck out to me the most on the trail this week.
I can imagine. Well, let me ask this, and I'm curious both of y'all's opinions on this. I feel like people are looking at this like strange 39-minute dance session in a lot of different ways. Like, is this just the weirdness of the campaign trail and like sometimes kooky things happen and like that's part of what it means to hold all of these events back to back over the course of months? Or is it a question of Trump's mental acuity? And some people are going there asking those questions of, is this a sign of someone who is having some struggles? What do you make of those questions?
So I think the context here is important, and that is that we had seen a lot of reporting about how Trump's, making verbal stumbles on stage, a lot of meandering answers that are pretty nonsensical. There's also him canceling a number of interviews recently, one with 60 Minutes, one with NBC, one with CNBC. There's new reporting that he canceled or he's said he can't do an interview with the Shade Room show, which is a kind of a celebrity gossip show because he's citing exhaustion. That was what Playbook from Politico reported. We have not confirmed that. But there's a lot of kind of small things that point in the direction of, the guy is kind of slowing down. He doesn't have the same kind of stamina that he used to, and he isn't able to make his messages as coherent as they used to be. And so we have seen a lot more talk about mental acuity, which of course is the issue that ultimately pushed President Joe Biden out of the race. And this is something that I found in looking at the polling that is a somewhat growing concern of the American people. There was a survey last year, Reuters Ipsos has been asking this question regularly, asked if he's mentally sharp and able to deal with challenges. He was 6 points positive on that measure last year. He's now 3 points negative. The Pew Research Center has shown a decline in the percentage who say he's mentally sharp. And then most striking for me was a Marquette University Law School poll in Wisconsin. Last year, it showed that 54% of voters there said that he was too old to be president. Its most recent poll showed that number is over 60%.
Oh, interesting. So that's a big drop-off, it seems.
These have been steady changes. Like, people are noticing this to some degree. It's not the same level that it was with Biden, certainly. Those numbers were a lot bigger with Biden. But it does seem to be something that's registering with people. And I think, to the extent we keep having scenes like this and meandering answers, it's going to lead at least some people to kind of notice that something interesting is going on and maybe something that's going to give them a little bit of pause.
Mm-hmm. I agree with Aaron's points. I think that especially with Biden now out of the race, Trump is now the elderly candidate. And so I think at least some voters will look at the events like this with some skepticism. It'll raise eyebrows. But it was interesting to kind of watch the reaction to this, because I sort of feel like people see what they want to see depending on how they feel about Trump. And I think that a lot of Democrats and Harris, who's basically said that Trump is unstable, viewed this listening session as a way to kind of confirm what they're arguing, which is that he is unstable and that he's not the same candidate he was and that he is showing signs of decline. But then I think people who like him think it was like a fun event. And so I think I feel like it's an example of the prism in which people see Trump and how their views of him really affect like how they read our stories, how they interpret them. And so I think that was one thing that Monday's event kind of revealed to me.
Kind of like a Rorschach test of a dance session, I guess.
That's one way to put it.
Trump is a never-ending Rorschach test for our country, certainly. I think this is an example of that.
Yeah, definitely.
I also want to talk about some comments that Trump made recently about, quote unquote, the enemy within. And I know that has gotten some attention. Can you guys talk through like what he said and why this has become a concern as well in these last weeks up until the election?
Yeah, so this began with some comments Trump made over the weekend. There was an interview with Maria Bartiromo on Fox News, which took place on Sunday.
I think the bigger problem is the enemy from within, not even the people that have come in and destroying our country. By the way, totally destroying our country.
The idea that the, quote, enemy within was a bigger threat to this country even than migrants. He's talked about, since then about how it's an even bigger threat than China and Russia. And I think what really caught people's eye was not just that rhetoric, which is something he's used before,
Wait, and what is he referring to? Like, what is the enemy within?
Radical leftists is the way he puts it.
We have some very bad people. We have some sick people, radical left lunatics.
The idea that there are people in this country who are antithetical to what this country is about and are damaging this country and that they need to be dealt with in some way. And what really caught people's eye is what he said should be done about this.
And it should be very easily handled by, if necessary, by National Guard, or if really necessary, by the military.
It's one thing to call your political adversaries the enemy within the country. When he first said this, I think last year, there was a lot of talk about how that echoes a lot of famous fascists from the past. This is rhetoric that they use too. But also the idea that you would literally use the military against these people, I think takes things to another level and really feeds into Democrats' arguments that Trump is, putting forward authoritarian ideas and that he's a real threat because he's potentially using the military against his political opponents.
Yeah, and I think it goes to people's fears about what a Trump presidency would be like. He did previously say, I am your retribution last year. And I think comments like this, comments about the enemy from within, really does raise concerns for people that he would enact a retribution campaign if he were elected in just 18 days. And so I think, to Aaron's point, it's rhetoric that I think people associate with authoritarianism. And it's language Trump has used throughout this campaign at different moments. But it's interesting to that he is bringing this up, 3 weeks before the election.
At other points in this week, he has lumped in the Pelosi's and Congressman Adam Schiff in with the enemy within. So whether he's talking about using the military against them, I think, is a matter of interpretation. But this is the kind of thing he does. He kind of allows people to believe what they want about his intent. And clearly, the idea that he would lump these Democratic politicians in with that enemy within, I think, takes this up to another level.
Before we move on from this, I also want to mention one other kind of important moment to note from this week on the campaign trail with Trump, and that is these comments that he made during a Univision town hall, specifically about January 6th. Let's listen to a little bit of that tape.
But that was a day of love from the standpoint of the millions. It's like hundreds of thousands. It could have been the largest group I've ever spoken before. They asked me to speak. I went and I spoke, and I used the term peacefully and patriotically. If you look at the
Marianne, what did you make of that?
I mean, I think it speaks to Trump's revisionist history about what happened on January 6th. And I think this is a theme that we've seen throughout his campaign, where he's basically falsely portrayed the events that took place on that day and his role in them. And so I think that those comments are just an example of him basically, trying to really downplay the violence that took place. He also talked about January 6th earlier this week and made other false statements where he said that only Trump support Ashley Babbitt had been killed.
Yeah, and this was notable because Trump claimed that, the other side didn't die. In fact, 3 police officers died shortly after the January 6th attack. And also, it's worth noting Ashley Babbitt was shot while trying to climb through a broken window into the speaker's lobby, which is very close to the House chamber.
I think that that's an interesting choice for him, just so close to the election, especially as he's trying to appeal to some of the more independent, more moderate voters who don't think that January 6th was a, quote, day of love.
Yeah, and I was really struck in that answer by the word we.
There were no guns down there. We didn't have guns. The others had guns, but we didn't have guns. And when I say we, these are people that walked down. This was a tiny percentage of the overall, which nobody sees and nobody shows.
Donald Trump was talking about, his false claim that there were no guns with the, January 6th rioters. And while he was making that, he said, we didn't have guns, which, by implication, that means that he was basically united with the people who were there. And this is really the first time that he has explicitly done that. He said we when talking about this at last month's debate, but then he seemed to correct himself and talked about this group of people. But I think that really speaks to, it's not just an effort to revise what happened that day. It's also an effort to, in a lot of ways, celebrate these people who rose up on his behalf. And that's been kind of a steady progression of his comments on this issue. But it's not something that the American people writ large really align with. So saying that so close to the election, as Marianne noted, is really an interesting choice.
All right, we're going to take a break here. And when we come back, we will turn to Kamala Harris and her most contentious interview this week with Fox News. We'll be right back. So this week, we saw Vice President Harris take questions in settings that she's really not usually appearing in. She went on Fox News in particular in this interview with their chief political anchor, Bret Baier. Before we dive into what she actually said, I do want to ask Aaron, what was the goal of this interview? Like, why did she agree to go on Fox News?
Yeah, so I think it's twofold. The first thing to note is that this is a pretty remarkable decision to make. Donald Trump in recent weeks has said that he wouldn't even do a debate that was moderated by Bret Baier. This is one of the Fox News hosts that he views as insufficiently on his side. I think for Harris, the idea is, one, that she would like to try to appeal to some of these Nikki Haley primary supporting Republicans who are maybe gettable for her. We had a New York Times Siena College poll recently that showed 9% of Republicans were backing her campaign. So there are some votes available for her there. But I think more broadly than that, we have seen in her media appearances recently a real tendency to go after large audiences. And whatever you think of Fox News, it has a large audience. It has an audience that has moderate voters, even some Democrats. It's not all kind of diehard MAGA Republicans who watch this. And actually, I think I saw the viewership numbers from this interview were extremely high. I think it was 7 million people or 8 million people.
Wow.
So she's done that. She does 60 Minutes. She did very popular podcasts. She went on with Charlemagne the God in a very widely viewed show with him, town hall style show. So she's trying to get out there to as many eyeballs and ears as she can. And I think this was very much in keeping with that.
And I also wondered if it was trying to draw a distinction between her and former President Trump in terms of an "I'm not scared" kind of message. Of we've seen Trump refuse to do the 60 Minutes interview that presidential candidates usually do, though he said it was because of their insistence on fact checking him, and then the fact that there's not going to be another presidential debate, even though Harris has said look, I'm game for another presidential debate. That if she's using this as an opportunity to be I'm not scared, and I will even go on Fox News and face what will likely be a pretty oppositional interviewer. But for you guys who saw it, what were the moments that stuck out to you in this interview?
I think the moments that stuck out was, one moment where Bret Baier asked her about, when did she notice that Biden was declining?
You met with him at least once a week for 3.5 years. You didn't have any concerns?
I think the American people have a concern about Donald Trump, which is why the people who know him best, including leaders of our national security community, have all spoken out. Even people who worked for him in the Oval Office, worked with him in the Situation Room, and have said he is unfit and dangerous and should never be president of the United States again.
And I thought it was really interesting how she tried to answer that and kind of pivoted to talking about Trump and trying to put out her message that Trump was the one who is on the ballot and not Joe Biden. And I think it sort of reflects kind of this argument that Republicans have been trying to make, in terms of questioning her credibility in terms of her replacement of Biden on the ticket. So I think that was one moment.
Yeah, it almost seemed at moments to be a little bit like a debate, like she was going up against an opponent. There was one moment where Bret Baier was asking her about Trump supporters and you say all these bad things about Trump supporters, but nearly half the country is supporting him.
It is not supposed to be a cakewalk for anyone.
So are they misguided, the 50%?
Listen,
are they stupid? What is it?
I would never say that about the American people. And in fact, if you listen to Donald Trump, if you watch any of his rallies, he's the one who tends to demean and belittle and diminish the American people. He's the one who talks about an enemy within, an enemy within.
There was another moment where he played a clip of a woman who blamed the Biden administration for their daughter's death. And, this was a person who had been killed by an immigrant. And Harris basically said she was sorry for that woman's loss, but that she pivoted and pointed to Donald Trump's role in killing off a bipartisan immigration bill earlier this year. So it was very adversarial and very much like a debate, I think.
Do you think that she won people over? That if the intention was maybe there's some meaningful subset of Fox News watchers who might vote for me, do you think that she might have persuaded them?
I mean, whenever we ask these questions, we're dealing with such small numbers of potential people who could be persuaded, but also those small numbers of potential people to be persuaded can matter because the race is just that close. I don't know if there were people who tuned into this who will necessarily be persuaded, but she was speaking to voters who probably weren't predisposed towards her. And so it gave her a chance to at least try to convince some people. Whether that'll actually be the case, we'll never actually know because it's so difficult to measure.
Yeah, and I think it also speaks to their strategy of really thinking that she can appeal to those undecided Republicans who want to move on from Trump. Many people in his cabinet have warned against a second term. And so I think it's really trying to appeal to that small group of undecided Republicans who might say, like, hey, I disagree with Harris's policies, but we can't have Trump back. And so it definitely feels like a play for that. But I agree, it's really hard to measure whether or not that's effective. Everything feels pretty baked in at this point. There's just such a small group of undecided voters that it's really hard to know which way it's going to go.
I want to play one more clip from this interview in which Harris kind of turns things back on her interviewer and suggests that Fox News was whitewashing Trump's comments about, as we talked about before, like the enemy within.
We asked that question to the former president today. Harris Faulkner had a town hall, and this is how he responded.
I heard about that. They were saying I was like threatening. I'm not threatening anybody. They're the ones doing the threatening. They do phony investigations. I've been investigated more than Alphonse Capone. He was the greatest gangster. No, it's true. But think of it. It's called weaponization of government. It's a terrible thing.
So,
Brett, I'm sorry, and with all due respect, that clip was not what he has been saying about the enemy within that he has repeated when he's speaking about the American people. That's not what you just showed.
Well, he was asked about that specific...
No, that's not what you just showed. In all fairness and respect to you...
I'm telling you, that was the question that we asked him.
You didn't show that, and here's the bottom line. He has repeated it many times, and you and I both know that. And you and I both know that he has talked about turning the American military on the American people. He has talked about going after people who are engaged in peaceful protest. He has talked about locking people up because they disagree with him. This is a democracy. And in a democracy, the president of the United States, in the United States of America, should be willing to be able to handle criticism without saying he'd lock people up for doing it.
What did you think of that moment?
Well, the issue here was that Fox News had played a clip of Trump kind of explaining his comments about the enemy within and using the military. They had not played the part about the military, but just him explaining what happened after that. And Harris's argument was basically like, you guys aren't focusing on what actually matters here, what he actually said about this. And she had a point. Like, Fox didn't actually play what Trump initially said. And actually, a day later on Thursday afternoon, Brett Bair, the Fox anchor who did this interview, acknowledged that he said that they had played the wrong clip. They had intended to actually play the clip from Trump's interview with Bartiromo, which, maybe that happened, but they didn't say that initially until a day later when this was getting a lot of criticism. And I think it kind of speaks to, we have seen hard evidence of Fox News and its executives saying that they feel the need to toe Trump's line. This was a revelation that we saw over and over again in the Dominion Voting Systems lawsuit, where Fox was ultimately forced to pay $787.5 million. The discovery portion of that lawsuit showed that Fox executives and hosts over and over again felt the need to emphasize things that were good for Trump and to ignore things that were bad for Trump. And so Harris, I think, really seized on this moment of saying, look, Fox, you're not accurately conveying what happened here. And that at least forced Fox to account for that a day later, which I thought was a really interesting moment.
All right. So looking ahead to next week, what will you both be paying attention to?
It's a great question. I think I'm going to just keep paying attention to Trump's schedule, I think, and sort of looking at what states he's going to be traveling to. I think just looking at, what messages does Trump really lean into in the closing 2 weeks? And does he also increasingly focus even more so on immigration? He has this line that I've noticed that he's been saying recently about how, he thinks that the border and immigration is a top issue, not the economy. And he keeps repeating it, which makes me think that he's going to lean even harder into that. But I think we'll have to see. But those are some of the things I'm watching next week.
As for me, next week, I think we sometimes oversell the numbers that we're seeing out of the early vote. A lot of states are now voting. Some of those states disclose the numbers of who is voting.
And Georgia in particular, right? Like, I feel like I saw a lot of headlines about record numbers of people who have voted so far in Georgia.
Yeah, lots of people are voting, and some states break this down by party. It doesn't tell you who they're voting for, but it tells you, whether registered Republicans or registered Democrats are voting. I don't think we should look at it as, Republicans are getting lots of voters out, and Democrats are getting lots of voters out. It's more like how many people are voting, and specifically, are Republicans taking the advice of their party leaders that they should vote early and vote by mail? Because the polls suggest there's not a whole lot of intent to do that, probably owing to Trump's many attacks on those two things.
The last thing that I'm keeping an eye on for in the next couple of weeks is the fallout from this news that we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, the death of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar. Obviously, foreign policy is not necessarily what people are making their decisions on in these last couple of weeks, but I do think that this is a story that, if that changes the game on what's happening with the potential ceasefire in Gaza or developments with getting hostages freed, that could be a potential game changer for Vice President Harris or for Trump for that matter. So we will keep an eye on that. I think that's all the time we have for today's episode. Marianne, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Marianne Levine is a national political reporter for The Washington Post.
And before we go, don't forget to subscribe to Aaron's amazing newsletter. As we've been getting into these last couple of weeks of the election, this newsletter is feeling more insightful than ever. Aaron, I feel like every time I open my email, just feeling stressed about the general closeness of everything. I feel like you are answering the questions that I have, and every time it comes into my inbox, I'm like, oh, okay, this is the explainer that I need in this moment. So, for everyone who has not yet subscribed, absolutely check it out. It's the Campaign Moment newsletter.
And I would encourage people to check out Thursday's edition, where I talked about how Trump's electoral college advantage doesn't seem to be what it once was. This is a guy who was elected despite losing the popular vote, but there's not as much of a difference between the swing states and the national popular vote as there was before. I thought that was pretty interesting. And you can always subscribe to the Campaign Moment newsletter in our show notes and at postreports.com.
Also, don't forget to follow the Campaign Moment show feed itself. If you're listening to this in the Post Reports feed, remember, go to the Campaign Moment, follow that podcast there. That is going to be critical as we get to Election Day. There are going to be extra episodes. Things are going to be moving very fast, and you're going to be wanting to follow the Campaign Moment podcast.
Today's episode was produced by Eliza Dennis and mixed by Sam Bair. It was edited by Reena Flores and Mary Jo Murphy, with help from Renita Jablonski.
Our team also includes Maggie Penman, Monica Campbell, Ted Muldoon, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Rennie Smirnovsky, Sabby Robinson, Emma Talkoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresnan, Laura Benshoff, Allison Michaels, and Elahe Azadi. I'm Martine Powers.
And I'm Aaron Blake.
Have a great weekend and see you soon.